Today's lesson, we're going to talk about another way to solve quadratic functions. Remember, a quadratic function is basically a trinomial or a binomial that we have, anything with x squared, any problem with x squared in it, and we're going to solve it. Remember, our solutions to these are called roots. We're figuring out what number can we plug in and it make it true. So this is called the quadratic formula. The good thing about the quadratic formula is it works no matter what type of problem it is, no matter what type of function. Some of the other methods that we've talked about only work on certain types of problems. The quadratic formula works all the time. No matter what the problem is, the quadratic formula will always work. So this may be one that you may just want to know and memorize, and you can use it all the time. It may not always be the easiest, it may not always be the fastest, but it will work on every single time. Before we talk about it, let's first go over something we talked about last chapter, which is that in a trinomial, we have to understand that the number in front of x squared is a, the number in front of x is b, and the number in the back by itself is our c. All right? It's not necessarily the first numbers are a, the second numbers are b, and the number in the back is a c. It depends on what it's with. The a is with x squared. Wherever the x squared is at, the a is the number in front of it. It's the coefficient of the x squared. The b is the coefficient of the x, wherever the x is at. And the c is what we call a constant. So it's the one that doesn't have a variable with it. Okay, we have to always be able to identify our a, b, and our c. Once we know our a, b, and our c, we are then going to plug it into what we call the quadratic formula. And then it just works itself out, and it will pop out our answers for our roots for our quadratic function. So here's the formula. It's going to look a lot more complicated than it actually is. But the formula is this: negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Make sure you understand this is 2 times a, this is 4 times a times c. We're multiplying those. So once again, negative b plus or minus, don't worry about the plus or minus, the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. It looks a lot more complicated. Let's kind of break it down a little bit here first. It says negative b. Whatever number is the b, it becomes negative. If b was 4, this would become negative 4. If b was 7, it would become negative 7. Now what happens if the b was already negative? Let's say in the original problem it was negative 8. It will become a positive 8. So this right here is the opposite sign of what it was in the problem. Whatever it is here, the opposite is it here. The next thing is this b squared. Understand that no matter what the b is, once you square it, this answer will always be positive. So if this b is a 3, it's 3 squared, this would make it 9. If it was negative 3 squared is also 9. No matter what your calculator says, once you square it right here, this answer will always become a positive number. That's a very important thing. That's where a lot of people mess up. All right, so what we're going to do is you figure out your a, your b, and your c, you plug it in, you work it out, which we'll show you how to do that, and you'll get your roots, you'll get your solutions. So let's do a couple examples. X squared minus 5x minus 14 equals 0. As always, first thing you have to do is get one side to be 0. Get one side to equal 0, which we already have. Now we have to identify our a, our b, and our c. Now remember, our a is the number with x squared. In this case, it's 1. Our b is the number with x, so it's negative 5. And our c is negative 14. So now we plug it into our formula. I'll rewrite the formula. Negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So now we're just going to plug in everything into the formula. Negative b. b is negative 5, so it will become positive 5. b squared, it's negative 5. Now, as I said, no matter what the b is, once we square it, it becomes positive. So negative 5 squared is positive 25. Minus 4 times a is 1, times c, which is negative 14, all over 2 times a. Since a is 1, 2 times 1 is 2. Okay, I've plugged everything in. b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a 2 times 1 is 2. Now, I haven't actually worked anything out. I've just plugged things in. So now we have to work it out. The first thing we're going to do is multiply these three numbers together. Everything else I'm going to leave where it's at. You multiply these three numbers. So 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 all over 2. Now, my advice to you is don't worry about the negatives. Do not worry about the negatives. Take your calculator and do 4 times 1 times 14. Just multiply the numbers together. Do not worry about the negatives. Do not worry about the negatives. Okay? 4 times 1 times 14 is 56. Now, we have to either make this plus 56 or it's going to be minus 56. Now, the easiest way to do this is here's the rule. If within these three numbers you have two negatives, it is going to be plus. If only one of these three numbers is negative, or if all three are negative, it's minus. So once again, if of these three numbers you have two negatives, it's plus, like in this one. If all three of these were negatives, or if only one was negative, then it will be minus. Okay, and we'll look at examples of those in a second. But this is going to be plus. So now we add those, 25 plus 56. So I have 5 plus or minus the square root of 81 all over 2. So then I add those. 25 plus 56 is 81. And now we take the square root of 81. What's the square root of 81? It is 9. So 5 plus or minus 9 all over 2. Now, once we have all that done, now here comes our last step. We have a plus or minus. What that means is we're going to break this problem up into two problems. One is going to be plus, one is going to be minus. So I'm going to have 5 plus 9 over 2 and 5 minus 9 over 2. So once I have broken this down, the square root of 81 is 9, I am then going to do two separate problems. 1 plus, 1 minus. 5 plus 9 is 14. 14 divided by 2 is 7. That's one of my roots. 5 minus 9 is negative 4. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. So my two roots are 7 and negative 2. This is a quadratic formula. Find A, B, and C, plug it in, work it out, and you get your two roots. Now, in this problem particularly, factoring at the beginning would be much easier. But factoring doesn't always work. So you have to be able to do the formula because on some problems, and we'll do one in a second, it doesn't work to factor. So we have to use the formula. So let's do another one. We'll go a little quicker this time because we just did one. So remember, get one side to be 0. That's already done. Identify your A, your B, and your C. So we're going to plug it into the formula. Hopefully you have your formula written down in your notes, so you're looking at it right now. Negative B, since B is negative, it becomes positive. Remember, it's always the opposite. So 3 plus or minus B squared, negative 3. Remember, this number is always positive. Once we squared, it is always positive. Even though it was negative 3, it's B squared, so once I squared, it's positive. Minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A. A is 2, 2 times 2 is 4. Okay? B squared plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A. So now we're going to keep everything the same except for I'm going to multiply these three numbers. Remember, forget about the negatives. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 5 is 40. You then have to determine if it's plus 40 or minus 40. How many negatives do I have total? I have 2 of them. That means it's plus. Remember, if only one is negative or if all three is negative, it's minus. 9 plus 40 is 49. Now, what is the square root of 49? It is 7. So we have 3 plus or minus 7 all over 4. this is where we split it up. 3 plus 7 over 4, 3 minus 7 over 4. And then we work each one out. 3 plus 7 is 10. 10 divided by 4 does not come out evenly, so we're going to leave it as a fraction, but we want it in simplest form, which is 5 halves. 3 minus 7 is negative 4 over 4, which is negative 1. So my two roots are 5 halves, which is a fraction, and negative 1. Let's look at our next problem. 3x to the second plus 2x equals 11. First thing we have to do is get one side to be 0, so we're going to subtract 11. So that's going to say 3x squared plus 2x minus 11 equals 0. So now we know our a is 3, our b is 2, our c is negative 11, and we're going to plug them into our formula. So remember our formula, negative b is 2, so negative 2, plus or minus, b squared, b is 2, so 4, minus 4, times a, times c, all over 2 times a. Since a is 3, 2 times 3 is 6. Okay? Follow your formula, plug it into the right spot. We're going to keep everything the same. We're going to multiply 4, 3, and 11. Remember, forget about the negatives. Forget about the negatives. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 11 is 132. Now, I have 2 negatives. Once again, if you have 2 negatives, it's plus. If you only have 1 negative, or if all 3 of these numbers were negative, it'd be minus. 4 plus 132 is 136. Okay, now, you may have already noticed the problem. 136 is not a perfect square. Meaning if you were to take your calculator and get 136, square root of 136, it comes out as a decimal. Because of that, for right now, we're going to leave it as square root of 136. But we are going to split it up. So we're going to have one that says negative 2 plus square root of 136 all over 6. And we're going to have another one that says negative 2 minus square root of 136 all over 6. So if this is not a perfect square, meaning it does not come out evenly, we're going to leave it just like that, and we're going to break it up into 2 problems. Now, that is not our final answer, because I want your answer as a decimal, rounded to the nearest hundredth. So you're going to have to take your calculator, you're going to need a scientific calculator, and we're going to have to work both these out. Now, the problem is that all of your calculators work a little differently. So I'm going to explain how to do it. Your calculator, you may have to mess around with it and change the order a little bit to figure out how exactly to work it. Negative 2 plus the square root of 136, then divide by 6. So negative 2 plus square root of 136, then click equals. Okay, so I did this top part. That should give you 9.6619, so on and so forth. Make sure you click the equals after that. Then you divide by 6, click equals again, and you should get 1.61. We're going to round that to the nearest hundredth, which is 2 decimal places. Okay, so negative 2 plus. Now, some of your calculators, you have to do square root and then the 136. Some of them you have to do 136 and then the square root button. So you're going to have to mess around with your calculator to figure out which one. But no matter what, you should get this. So mess around with your calculators enough times till you can get 1.61. And if not, let me know and I'll help you. Let's try the bottom one. Negative 2 minus, once again, you either have to do square root 136 or 136 then square root. But click equals. After you do the top part, make sure you click equals. That should give you negative 13.66. Then divide by 6. Click equals again. Make sure you click equals after each part. And you should get negative 2.27. Or negative 2.28 if you round correctly. I did that wrong. Should be negative 2.28. Okay? Make sure you work with those two calculators, or your calculators, to make sure you get those right two answers. All right? So that is if the square root is not a perfect square. It doesn't come out. Let's do one more. Negative 2x to the second plus 2x minus 3 equals 0. One side is already 0. So our a is negative 2, our b is positive 2, and our c is negative 3. So if we plug it into our formula, negative b, negative 2, plus or minus b squared, 2 squared is 4, minus 4, times a, times c, all over 2 times a. A is negative 2, 2 times negative 2 is negative 4. So I just plugged it into our formula. Remember, we're going to keep everything the same. We're going to multiply these three numbers. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 3 is 24. Now we have to determine if it's plus 24 or minus 24. How many negatives do I have? 3. All 3 are negatives. If all 3 are negatives, then it is minus. Remember, if all 3 are negatives, or only one of the numbers is negative, it's minus. If 2 are negatives, it's plus. 4 minus 24 is negative 20. Now, you should then take your calculator, if you don't already know, and take the square root of negative 20. What is the square root of negative 20? If you do it on your calculator, it's going to come out as air. It will always come out as air, because it is not possible to take the square root of a negative. There is no such thing as a square root of a negative. So if you ever have square root of a negative on your calculator, it will always come out as an error. You could try square root of negative 8, square root of negative 10, square root of negative 100. It doesn't matter. If it's the square root of a negative, it will be an error. Because of that, because you're not allowed to take the square root of a negative, if you ever have a problem like this and the square root comes out to be a negative, once you combine all these together, you have to combine all these together till it comes down to one number. And if that number is negative, your answer is no solution. But remember, that is only if inside the square root, what we call the radical, it is a negative number at the very end. Then it's no solution. So that is solving using the quadratic formula. The good thing is the quadratic formula, even though it takes a while, once you get the hang of it, it goes pretty quickly, it goes pretty smoothly, and it works for every type of problem. Unlike factoring, which only works on the ones you can factor. Quadratic formula works every time. Get one side to be 0, find A, B, C, plug it in, work it out, and you should be good to go.